Have you ever just looked up at the night sky and wondered, what is all this stuff made of? Or maybe you've looked in the mirror and asked yourself, how am I supposed to live my life? Well, if you have, you're taking part in a tradition that is thousands of years old. Today, we're going to trace that tradition all the way back to its source, right to the beginning of our collective search for truth.
You know, it really all comes down to these two huge curiosities. First, there's the world out there. What's the nature of the universe? What's the fundamental stuff that makes up reality? And then there's the world in here. What are we? And in the middle of all this reality, what's the right way to live a good life? These two questions, right here, they're the twin engines that got Western philosophy up and running.
So, let's set the scene. Our story kicks off in ancient Greece. Now, what was so special about this time and place? Well, a really key ingredient was that they didn't have a super powerful priestly class dictating what you could and couldn't think about. This intellectual freedom was huge. It let a brand new idea take root, the idea of chasing knowledge, not because it's useful, but just for the sheer joy of understanding.
Okay, so to see how all these ideas evolved, we're going to climb what I like to call a ladder of ideas. We'll start at the very beginning, at the dawn of thought, and see how the questions move from the cosmos to us, human beings. Then we'll get into the great systems built by giants like Plato and Aristotle, see how philosophy became a practical guide for living, and finally, think about what this endless search really means for us right now. All right, our journey begins right here, in a coastal city called Miletus. The very first philosophers, they were just struck by this one overwhelming fact. Everything is always changing. I mean, think about it. You see the season cycle, you see people being born, growing up, getting old, and dying. And looking at all this constant motion, they started to ask a question that was totally revolutionary. Is there something permanent, something stable underneath it all? Now, instead of just saying, oh, the gods did it, these thinkers wanted a rational explanation. They were on the hunt for what they called the arche, the single underlying principle or substance that everything else comes from. One guy, Thales, guessed it was water. Another, Anaximenes, thought it was air. But honestly, the specific answer wasn't nearly as important as the question itself. This was the moment we shifted from myth to reason, a total game changer. So as these arguments about the cosmos got more and more complex, something interesting started to happen. The focus began to shift. The philosophical camera, you could say, started to pan away from the stars and zoom in, turning its gaze inward, toward us. And this sets up the first great philosophical showdown. On one side, you've got Heraclitus. He says reality is change. Everything is in constant motion, like a river. On the other side is Parmenides, who uses pure logic to argue the exact opposite. He says true reality has to be eternal and unchanging, which means all the change we see with our eyes, it's just an illusion. This is a huge conflict, right? What do you trust more, your senses or your reason? This big debate about reality really paved the way for a new set of questions. See, as the Greek city-states grew, they started bumping into other cultures, Persians, Egyptians, you name it, and they quickly realized their own customs and laws weren't the only ones out there. This led a group of thinkers called the Sophists to ask a really pointed question. Are our laws and morals based on nature, or are they just made up? Are they just social conventions we all agree to?
And that question set the stage perfectly for one of the most important figures in history, Socrates. He basically grabbed the philosophical spotlight and aimed it squarely at the self. He argued that before we can even try to understand the universe, we have to understand ourselves first. He'd famously wander around Athens, bugging people, asking them to define big ideas like justice or courage, because he believed that true knowledge was the absolute key to living a good life.
Okay, so after Socrates, philosophy enters this whole new phase. We're moving beyond just asking specific questions to actually building massive, all-encompassing systems of thought. And this is the era of the two titans who would basically define Western thinking for the next 2,000 years, Plato and his star student, Aristotle. To really get a handle on Plato's whole system, his allegory of the cave is the perfect tool. He asks us to imagine these prisoners, chained up, who have only ever seen shadows flicker on a wall. For them, the shadows are reality. But what if one prisoner is freed? They slowly make their way out of the cave into the real world, and eventually they can see the sun itself, the source of all light. For Plato, this is a perfect metaphor. Our physical world is just like those shadows. It's a pale reflection of a higher, perfect, eternal reality he called the world of forms. And then you have Aristotle. He was Plato's best student, but he took his teacher's ideas and completely flipped them on their head. Where Plato looked up to a higher spiritual world for truth, Aristotle pointed right back down to earth. He argued that reality is found right here, in the physical world we can touch and see and study. For Aristotle, knowledge wasn't about remembering some perfect form. It was about getting your hands dirty, observing the world, and using your reason to make sense of it all. But the world of Plato and Aristotle, this world of stable city-states, it didn't last. After Alexander the Great died, the Greek world was thrown into chaos. And in this new, scary, unpredictable reality, the focus of philosophy changed again. The big question wasn't, what is reality anymore? It became something much more urgent. In a world that feels completely out of my control, how can I find some peace and live a good life?
I mean, the political ground just fell out from under people's feet. Alexander's empire shattered, and individuals who were used to the security of their little city-state suddenly felt totally adrift. They were now subjects in these vast, impersonal empires. They needed a new kind of philosophy, not one that explained the entire cosmos, but one that could be a personal roadmap to inner strength.
So 2 major schools of thought popped up to meet this need. Both of them were aiming for a state of inner calm they called ataraxia. The Stoics said the path to peace was through virtue and radically accepting your fate. They believed the universe was guided by a rational order, the logos, and tranquility comes from living in tune with it, basically not worrying about what you can't control. The Epicureans, on the other hand, offered a different route. They said peace comes from intelligently managing your desires, seeking out simple, modest pleasures, and, most of all, avoiding pain and anxiety.
So, from the shores of Ionia to the schools of Athens and all the way through the Hellenistic world, we followed this incredible intellectual journey. But here's the thing, it's a journey that doesn't really have an end. It's really a story about a fundamental human drive that's still with us.
And this quote, it really nails it. Philosophy isn't some dusty museum of old wrong answers. It's the living, breathing story of the human mind wrestling with the biggest questions there are. Even the ideas that didn't pan out, the theories that were abandoned, they're all part of this relentless, messy, beautiful search for understanding. And that brings us to today. Because when you get right down to it, have the fundamental questions really changed? We still stare out into space and ask what the universe is made of. We just use particle accelerators now instead of only pure reason. And we absolutely still debate how to live a good and meaningful life. The great conversation that these ancient thinkers started is still going on. We are all a part of it. The search for truth. It continues.